politics playing no twist or spin. Alberta Unfiltered, let's begin.
Good day, Michael. It's great to have you here on Alberta Unfiltered. Actually, it's a real privilege and honor. I've been following you for a number of years now, and every time I hear you speak, I'm not only inspired, but I'm challenged with new information. So thank you for being here.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Michael. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about you. So I know you're a PhD, you're a doctor. Now, what are you a doctor in?
I have a PhD in political science.
That's a difficult degree to get.
Well, generally the arts degrees tend to be easier than like engineering and science and things like that. But, it is competitive to, get into graduate school and to get things done. It was very fun. I really enjoyed graduate school. And I was glad to have done, I did a BA and MA at the University of Calgary.
Okay.
And I then did my PhD at the University of Alberta. That's actually how we ended up in Edmonton, was that, I was living in Calgary and I was accepted to the PhD program here. And so that's why I came up here. So it was 30 years ago. And so, I've been out of the program for a long time. So my area of expertise in graduate school was actually education policy in Alberta. I was always interested in Alberta politics, and I focused on Alberta politics.
So when you say graduate school, do you mean your master's degree or your PhD?
Both, actually. At the University of Calgary, my master's thesis was on the debate about private education in Alberta during the 1980s.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then when I came to University of Alberta for a PhD, my dissertation was on education policy generally under the progressive conservative government, because when Pierre became premier, he made some big changes in education policy in Alberta, and a lot of them were very good. And so that's kind of the theme of my dissertation, was the changes that Peter Lougheed brought into education policy in Alberta, and how that ultimately led to more educational choice for parents over time.
Okay, so we're going to touch on that after, because we're going to talk with you today on 3 topics. The first is about a book that you wrote called Leaving God Behind, and I just finished the book and made a few notes. It was very, very good. It changed my way of thinking about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this is a very fascinating history you write. We're then going to have a second time of talking about books you wrote for a period of time about why Alberta should separate from Canada. I have read one of those. The one book I have not read that you wrote recently is Time to Leave. As you can tell, I haven't read it. And this is the how, I understand, correct?
It has a section in how on there, but actually my previous book, No Other Option, has a bit of that in that book as well. I talk about just the basic idea. In No Other Option, I talk about the secession reference case and a bit about the Clarity Act. But then there were people who were raised objections saying, even though those options are there through constitutional law and legislation, it's still going to get blocked if Alberta moves in that direction. And so Time to Leave has a section on the how, but explaining why those objections are not valid.
Okay, let's talk about that in the third part of our discussions today. Okay, so first of all, Leaving God Behind. Why did you write this book?
For a very long time, I've seen problems in Canada because of the Charter. Like when I was at university, a couple of my professors were Ted Morton and Reiner Knopf, and they had written about what they call the court party, how left-wing lawyers and judges were essentially using the Charter to implement changes into Canada, into Canadian public policy through court cases, which was actually happening. And they wrote books and things on that, which was very interesting. And I wanted to, understand and research that myself. So I started researching the effect of the Charter. And I think the spark of it for me too was also learning about the Lord's Day Act and how it was struck down because of the Charter.
That's a very interesting topic, and you touched on that, and I learned a lot from what you wrote. Now, what I understand, the beginning of the book, you explain that historically, Canada as a whole was constitutionally Christian.
Mm-hmm.
It was universally and collectively Christian. What does Christian mean?
In that particular context, it's referring to a particular worldview,
okay.
Like the worldview that comes out of the Bible.
All right.
Every political system is based on a particular worldview. There's no such thing as a neutral political system.
Right.
So if you don't have a Christian political system, you have a non-Christian political system, which could be Muslim, could be secular, but there's always a worldview basis for every political system. And because Canada was founded, by countries that had a Christian basis to them themselves, it was inevitable that foundation for Canada would also be Christian as well. So, for example, like Britain, England has a Church of England, an established church. Like, it's not a very good church right now, but historically it was more conservative. Sure. And of course, Scotland has the Church of Scotland. Historically, they were conservative, and so that provided a Christian legal basis for their entire system. Okay. So those were the people that founded Canada. Like, when it comes to Quebec, France was very deeply Catholic when it founded Quebec. So Quebec is a little bit different in the sense it's Catholic rather than Protestant. Mm-hmm. But in both cases, it's foundationally Christian. Mm-hmm. So when Britain founded Canada, the political system that started here, the constitutional system, was all rooted in a Christian worldview. The laws and policies. And so leaving God behind shows how some of that expresses itself in public policy. Yeah. One of the best examples being Canada's historic definition of marriage. Sure. Like, because Canada's definition of marriage until 2003 included the term Christendom right in the definition.
Did it?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Okay.
Thank you. So in your book, you indicate that it was very universal. And now we know that Alberta became a province of Canada in 1905. Then in 1906, the Lord's Day Act was enacted for all of Canada. So when Alberta came into Canada, it was with the understanding that Alberta as a province was joining a Christian nation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, like, I don't think they thought of it quite those terms, but that was certainly the understanding would not have been different from that. Just it's kind of an unconscious thing. Like, people who were in Canada, I don't think it was the kind of thing they discussed very much. But I mean, as I mentioned in the book, John A. Macdonald himself said in the House of Commons that Canada is a Christian country. Sure. And during the debates over the Lord's Day Act in 1906, there was a number of politicians who defended the adoption of the Lord's Day Act because Canada was a Christian country. Like, it was assumed, it was an assumed thing. People just assumed it was a Christian country, so it would come out in discussions in some cases. So when Alberta became a province, there was no other understanding of this country.
It was taken for granted.
Taken for granted is the best way to put it, yes.
Okay. So then something fundamentally changed in the 1960s. Can you explain what happened in the 1960s?
Generally speaking, in all of the Western world, there was kind of a turn away from Christianity and more towards secularism. Like, this happened not just in Canada, but the United States and Britain and other countries. But one of the most important things as pertains to this book is that that's when Pierre Trudeau became involved in politics. He was first elected into politics, and he became the Justice Minister. And as Justice Minister, he brought forward a proposal for a Canadian Charter of Human Rights. It was actually a written book published by the Government of Canada by Pierre Trudeau, his first proposal for the Charter of Rights. I believe that was 1968. That's where he argues for the charter and why he thought Canada would need a charter. Huge changes began in Canada when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in 1968. I mean, that began the process that would lead to the charter being adopted. And as it pertains to Alberta, he would be the Prime Minister who would lead the attack on Alberta in the 1970s and in an unprecedented way, like with his export tax on oil in 1973 and other policies were brought in because of the energy crisis. Pierre Trudeau's government attacked Alberta in a way that no province in Canadian history has ever been attacked by a federal government. So, and then there's other things about Pierre Trudeau as well, but I guess I don't want to get sidetracked. But Pierre Trudeau changed Canada with the Charter. And so the 60s are significant with Pierre Trudeau becoming part of Canadian politics, becoming Prime Minister, bringing in his proposal for the Charter, which would ultimately, come into effect in 1982. He fundamentally changed Canada, and that was his agenda. He didn't like Canada the way he saw it in 1960s. He wanted a different country. And how do you change a country? If you change the Constitution, you change the country. You
bring that out really, really well in this book in a way I'd never thought of it. So up until that point, before Pierre Trudeau came in, you write in your book that our elected officials were the lawmakers. But what happened with the Charter is that the lawmakers who were, changed in and out with elections, no longer were the real lawmakers. Law was put in the hands of the judges. So can you explain that a bit?
For sure. That was part of Trudeau's agenda right from the beginning. And that book I mentioned, his proposal of the Canadian Charter of Human Rights, was published by the government. He mentions right in there that this would involve transferring some powers from elected officials to the judges. He says it in kind of an understated kind of way, but he does say that we'd be turning away from parliamentary supremacy, which was Canada's original system, where elected officials make the final decision. We'd be turning away from parliamentary supremacy, more towards a situation where judges are making more important decisions. he said it in an understated way, but it is very clear in his document that that was his intention. Sure. And actually, as the book points out, there was several years from the time that he made the proposal until it was adopted. There were several years. Yeah. And the Parliament would have hearings on that, this Parliament, the House of Commons or the Senate. And during those hearings, political scientists and law professors would come before the committees and say, if we adopt this Charter of Rights, that will transfer power to the judges. Like the scholars were saying that explicitly in the open, that this is what's going to happen. And in fact, at least one of the scholars said, if you adopt this Charter of Rights, the Lord's Day Act will be struck down.
Yes, and which one was that? Do you recall?
That might have been Professor Smizer from the University of Saskatchewan.
Okay. Now, there were a couple of real opponents to the Charter coming in. One was Premier Sterling Lyon from the province of Manitoba. And can you tell us a bit about Sterling Lyon?
Yeah, Sterling Lyon was Premier of Manitoba from 1977 to 1981. Okay. He was only a one-term Premier, and then he lost the election in 1981. But he was a traditional Canadian Conservative. He really believed in Canada's political system. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a lot of problems with Canada's political system, and we can criticize various aspects of it. But when you compare Canada to the rest of the world, Canada's actually got one of the best political systems historically. Are you
talking about pre-1982?
Yes,
or what's,
yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's all
yeah, because I'm talking about Sterling Lyon, what he experienced. He had previously been, I think, an Attorney General in Manitoba. Okay. So he was familiar with these kinds of issues. And so when he saw Pierre Trudeau's proposal to change the Constitution, he did not like that at all. Sure. He said, look, we've got a system that works compared to the rest of the world. Like you said, pre-1982, compared to the rest of the world, we have one of the best political systems with most freedoms and rights that people have enjoyed. Why would we bring a fundamental change into a system that already works?
Yes.
What's wrong with our system? It's working fine. And so that was kind of his defense about why we should keep the Constitution we have rather than make these fundamental changes. And of course, then people on the left would say, oh, you're against human rights. You know, that's the kind of criticism that was laid against him because he's against changing the Constitution to add a Charter of Rights. But he wanted to defend Canada's old system of parliamentary supremacy, the system that had worked so well for Canada over those years. And, you know, one of the points he would make was that there are countries with written bills of rights that have less rights protection than Canada. You know, even with the American system, like the U.S. Bill of Rights has many, many good things about it. But you have to remember that slavery was still in effect in the United States after the Bill of Rights came into effect for several decades.
Really?
And then after slavery was defeated with the Civil War,
yes,
what were called Jim Crow laws in the South were in effect, which meant that blacks were not treated equally to whites in several states. And that was with the United States Bill of Rights still being in effect. So even having the Bill of Rights isn't a complete guarantee. There has to be more than that. So the point is not to criticize the U.S. Bill of Rights, but to say that that's not a system that's always better than the system that we had previously.
So what you're saying is the system we had before 1982 was better than even the system in the United States now.
In a sense, like you could argue that for sure. Like it wasn't worse than the U.S. system. Like adopting a written Bill of Rights was not necessarily an improvement because we were already very comparable to the United States in many protections of rights. Right. Like we weren't worse than them. And maybe we're better on some things like the segregation of the races and things like that. So that we could argue that we were better, but I would at least argue that we were at least as good as, and that adding a U.S. style system to our Constitution was not improving it. It was changing it, but wasn't necessarily improving it.
Okay. Now, you did not mention this lady in your book, but I'd like to touch on her briefly because she really is an important lady in Alberta history, Dr. Ruth Gorman. What did she think about the new charter?
Yeah, well, Dr. Ruth Gorman was very opposed to the charter in 1981. It's important to understand that Ruth Gorman was a very influential lawyer in Alberta. Okay. She was one of the first female lawyers in Alberta. She was a friend of Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, and she worked with him on the Canadian Bill of Rights. You know, that was around 1960. Yeah. She had helped to get First Nations people to vote in Canada for the first time. So she was a prominent civil rights lawyer in Alberta for several decades. And when Pierre Trudeau brought out his proposal for a Charter of Rights, like 1980, 1981, when they were seriously considering that, she was adamantly opposed to it. Mm-hmm. So she traveled around Alberta giving talks as to why people should oppose Pierre Trudeau's Charter of Rights, and she wrote columns for newspapers doing that. And her main argument was that the Charter of Rights deliberately excluded property rights. And that's
very important.
Absolutely, because when we look at the history of the English-speaking countries in particular, we think of John Locke and the defense. Our basic rights protections are the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, those rights protections restrict what the government can do. The purpose of life, liberty, the right to life, liberty, and property is that restricts that the government cannot, kill you without a just cause, say for a murder or something like that, and they can't put you in jail without just cause, and they can't take your property. So that restricts what the government can do. So when you remove one of those, you're actually reducing the restrictions on government, which increases the power of government. And so this is a very good reason as to why someone would oppose the Charter of Rights in the early 1980s, as many Albertans did, because they saw that the property rights protections for Canadians would be reduced from being from the way it was before, because it would not have constitutional protection like other rights. So it's getting a secondary status. You'd have written protective rights and then rights that aren't written in the Constitution. So it reduces the property rights, and in that sense expands the power of government in some respects. So Ruth Gorman was very opposed to the Charter and spent her efforts, at that time trying to stop it. Of course, she wasn't able to, but she was involved in the Western Canada Concept Party for that reason and spoke for the party. In fact, she was one of the founders of the party, I understand, and she did a lot of legal work for them. So she was a prominent person within that party, and that was primarily because of her opposition to the Charter of Rights, and she didn't want that.
Okay, question arises then. So is part of her work and other work during that time, is that what resulted in the election of a MLA in Alberta in the 80s?
Yeah, that was the same party, so she would have been part of that. Okay. But the single biggest factor that led to that election of that MLA. So this is 1982. Yes. There was a by-election in the Olds Didsbury constituency. Like Bob Clark was the MLA there. He was leader of the Social Credit Party, which was really declining that time.
Very interesting constituency.
Yes. So he resigned, resulting in a by-election. And the Western Canada Concept Party ran its very first candidate in an election in Alberta. And he won, it was a plurality. He got 42%, which was much more. The Conservatives and the Social Credit got to split up the rest of the vote. But it was a very significant event. I mean, it was an event of national significance. Yes. That an MLA from Alberta was a separatist. For the first time, we had a separatist elected in Western Canada. So it was national news, and it gave credibility to the separatist movement, much more credibility than it ever had before to have an elected official. But yeah, this was the same time period, and she was part of that party that led to that MLA getting elected.
Good for her.
Yes.
Okay, let's get back to the book here. I find it interesting that right away, shortly after the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was put in place, the first act that was challenged was the Lord's Day Act. Can you tell us a bit about that?
The example of the Lord's Day Act is very, very important because it shows the difference of Canada's constitutional law before and after the Charter.
Let me just ask you this first. Sure. Your book talks about this being related to the fourth commandment. Now, in the Bible, there's a list of the biblical constitution, I'm going to call it. Is that fair?
Yes.
And it's 10 items. And this is the fourth item in the list.
Yes.
What is it? What does it say?
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy.
Okay.
So the Lord has determined that there's one day of the week where we rest from our normal labors and, emphasize spiritual exercises in terms of maybe going to church or praying and reading, but not being involved in our regular day-to-day activities, to take a rest from our day-to-day activities so we can think more about God and what He means to us.
A lot of medical people might say it's good for us to have a rest, but that's a different topic. Okay, so then we take a look, and so this was challenged, and I can tell you that my uncle's brother was the lawyer that took this case on behalf of Alberta to the Supreme Court. William Hinkle was his name. And I recall in a family gathering, he said something to the effect that the Charter would be the undoing of Canada. Then I did not know what he meant. I understand that Ruth Gorman said something similar. Is that the case?
Well, she thought that the Charter would be very, very harmful for Canada. Okay. So the terminology might have been different, but she thought it was harmful, especially to Western Canada, because, our economy is a resource-based economy. It's based on private property and development of the resource base. And so if we lose our property rights, the federal government could come in and take what is ours, but that would certainly destroy what we have in terms of our rights and freedoms. And so she was calling upon Canadians to fight against the Charter, to defend our rights and freedoms against the Charter in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. This fourth commandment about resting on the Sabbath was taken to the Supreme Court, and based on what the Supreme Court decided, changed history. What was the decision?
Okay, the decision was that the Lord's Day Act could not be legislation in Canada because it violated freedom of religion and conscience, which had been established by the Charter of Rights. So that it changed how Canada looked at the freedom of conscience and religion and what the government would be able to legislate based on that. So I just want to give a little bit of background to that. Sure. So the Lord's Day Act, when it was legislated in 1906, would have been very popular at the time. That's why it was able to be passed. Sure. So over decades, it would lose its popularity a bit because, like during World War I, they had to suspend the Lord's Day Act because you have to fight wars on the Lord's Day as well as other days. Same thing happened in World War II. So you have several years where people get used to not having to follow the Lord's Day Act, where they could do whatever they wanted on the Lord's Day. So that contributed to a decline in popularity of the Lord's Day Act. Some people not wanting it to be in power anymore. So in the early 1960s, some businessmen in Hamilton challenged the Lord's Day Act at the Supreme Court level and said, the Lord's Day Act violates religious freedom as we understand it in Canada. And the Supreme Court in the early 60s said, no, it does not violate our freedom of religion as it is in Canada. We've always had Lord's Day protection in Canada's history, and so it can't violate our concept of religious freedom because we've had religious freedom and the Lord's Day Act at the same time or something like that, along the lines of the Lord's Day Act.
This is Canada.
Exactly.
This is
Canada.
What happens.
Those things work together. They're not opposed to each other. So that was before the Charter was adopted. So, 20 years later, after the Charter is adopted, you have the same challenge against the Lord's Day Act, and this time it is struck down. So that shows that's the clearest demonstration of how the Charter changed Canada in one particular instance, because this law was challenged before the Charter, and the Supreme Court upheld the law. Then it's challenged about 20 years later with the Charter in place, and it's struck down on the basis of the Charter. That shows the fundamental change that happened in Canadian constitutional law as a result of the Charter being adopted. We have a different conception now of religious freedom than we had before.
When I was reading your book, I thought what Pierre Trudeau did is require almost judges to become the battering rams against Christianity. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, because the Charter, by becoming part of the Constitution, the Charter became part of our Constitution. So it's the rules by which the judges have to make laws. Yes. So there's new rules in, and judges have to make laws according to those rules, the constitutional laws of the Charter.
Whether they like it or not.
Whether they like it or not. So those new rules would compel judges to make decisions in conformity with the new Charter. Yes,
and not only that, we have something in Canada called common law, that's based on precedences. Mm-hmm. So judges have to look to law that put in place what other judges think, and then just keep following it. Mm-hmm. So we have the Big M decision, and then the next case comes along, and the same thing and the same reasoning has to follow.
Right, exactly. And so in the book, then I also talk about what happened in public education, especially in Ontario.
Yes.
And so the Big M drug mart decision played into what happened there. That was one of the decisions they would cite.
Yes.
So in Ontario, which had a very, Christian-influenced public system for a very long period of time, they had laws in Ontario where there'd be religious exercises in the public schools. So the schools would begin or end with the Lord's Day, with the Lord's Prayer or Bible reading.
Yes.
And there was also a Christian educational component in the Ontario's public school system, where classes could be held weekly that included religious instruction.
Sure.
And it was Christian-based instruction. So there's the two components. There's the religious exercises, the opening and closing with Lord's Prayer or Bible reading, and then the Christian instruction itself. So those are two separate components, and they were both struck down separately as being opposed to the Charter. And of course, that comes out of the Big M drug mart decision, because the judges are using the Big M drug mart decision as a precedent for the rulings that they're making. They also used other interesting precedents. Like in the United States, in the early 1960s, there were two very significant court decisions for Christians. In 1962, it was the Engel versus Vitale decision, which put prayers out of the American public schools for the first time. These are Supreme Court decisions. Yes. Then the following year was the Abington versus Schempp decision, which put religious exercises such as Bible reading out of American public schools. So those are like two companion cases.
They're not only not required, they're not allowed.
That's right.
They're not allowed to put
That's right. You can't have those prayers and Bible readings in American public schools, which had been in public schools since the very beginning. Yes. So this is what the Americans were used to.
Yes. You write in your book that the Latin word for religion is actually bind together. And then you also make a note elsewhere that when you had Christianity, there was a collective responsibility or a duty to God.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Not to anyone else. So the religion of Christianity, is it fair to say, calls upon people to have a collective responsibility to God.
Yes.
God Almighty, the biblical God Almighty.
Right.
Okay. Then we move to your thoughts that what took place, you called it secular humanism?
Yes.
Can you just explain what you mean by secular humanism?
Sure. Like during the 20th century, there was two humanist manifestos.
Okay.
The first one was in the 1930s, and then the second one might have been in the 1970s. But the humanist manifestos were prominent, were written by prominent citizens who were writing out an alternative philosophy for Western society.
Oh, an alternative philosophy for Western society?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
I mean, that's my terminology, but you can go online and see the humanist manifestos.
Okay.
Like the first one had prominent citizens like Dewey. There was a very famous American educational philosopher, John Dewey, who influenced the American public education system. So he was one of the signers of that first Humanist Declaration, the Humanist Manifesto. Then the second one, I guess I don't remember the specific prominent citizens who signed these, but you can look them up online. But basically, they were describing the philosophy of the North American elite. That we need a social philosophy in their view that does not recognize God, or at least does not recognize that He's influential in our society. So human beings, we have to look to our own resources for the well-being of society. We look to human resources. We can't look to God to save us. We can't look to God for help, or even guidance in political matters. We have to look to within ourselves as humans to what humans can devise through reason or science. So that's kind of what the summary of what the idea of humanism, secular humanism, is. Okay. So that became the philosophy that dominated the public schools in Canada and the United States.
So collectively then, if we're not going to have a duty to God as a society, a collective society, what collectively do we have a duty to?
Well, if we remove God from the conversation, then what becomes the highest authority on earth? And it's the state. If you don't appeal to God, you're left with a state. Because historically, our conception of freedom in the Western world, and especially the English-speaking world, is that God is the ultimate authority, and we can always appeal to God. Like God is above the government. So we can judge the government by God's standards and say the government is wrong because God says so. So there's a higher authority that we can appeal to beyond the government itself. As soon as you remove God from that picture, the state becomes the highest authority.
Oh, okay. So in your book, you call it the deification of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the state became our God. And we saw that during COVID, where everybody wanted to obey the government. Okay. And that makes complete sense. Now let's go back. You were talking about the American decisions that have made a big difference. So people are talking a lot about how wonderful America is right now. But let's talk about the American decisions that negatively influenced Christianity in Canada.
Yeah, so the American system, there's many good things about it, and especially historically, there are good things about it. But during the 20th century, and especially after the Second World War, the Supreme Court began to adopt a different theory of interpretation of the Constitution, and they began to take a much stronger role in political decisions, and they tended to move the country towards the left. And so those decisions I mentioned, the Engel versus Vitale of 1962, and Abington versus Schempp in 1963, that put Bible reading and prayer out of the American schools. Especially that Engel versus Vitale, when it came out, it was one of the most unpopular Supreme Court decisions in American history. Mm-hmm. People did not like that. I mean, it was a complete change from the past, where those kinds of religious exercises were allowed in public schools. Sure. But the Supreme Court was taking a very different direction than before. It was putting those things out of American public schools and secularizing American public schools. Now, those particular decisions were not relevant to Canada at that time. But after the Charter was adopted, suddenly American precedents became relevant in some cases for Canadian cases. So when some Ontario parents in the 1980s, they wanted religious exercises out of Ontario schools. And to make a long story short, the Ontario Court of Appeal in 1988 struck down the religious exercises in Ontario schools, based on Big M Drug Mart, partly, as we talked about before, but they also referred to the Engel versus Vitale and Abington versus Schempp decisions in the United States to help justify their decision for putting religious exercises out of Ontario schools. So it's kind of like they imported the American jurisprudence, American First Amendment jurisprudence into Canadian law to help justify doing the same thing in Ontario that those American decisions had done in the United States. And so it was actually those, when I saw that, that's actually was quite a spark for me in helping me to understand how the Charter was changing Canada. In the same way that the Supreme Court started secularizing the United States, courts in Canada were secularizing Canada, even by adopting some of the same jurisprudence from the United States. So those American court cases were very influential in Canada in terms of our public education system.
Now, we have a generation of children then, and young people, who probably don't even know what the Lord's Prayer is anymore. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think we definitely, in the sense, like our society in Canada has been secularizing, for several decades. But once you start to remove those things from the schools themselves, and when you remove them from schools themselves, people get the impression that there's something wrong with them. You know what I mean? Like if you have these prayers or Bible readings and suddenly they're absolutely forbidden in the school, it's like there's something wrong with this. We better not have that. You know what I mean? It gives people a negative impression of what those things are. And so we have declining church attendance, and that would play very much into the fact that children don't know much about God and His commandments anymore, because people are going to church less frequently. But also these situations with the schools, with certain Christian content being removed. All of these things work together so that children are no longer familiar with Christianity the way they used to be.
So you talk about education, and in this book, you seemed very confident, like you say, with God, there is always hope. You are quite confident in turning Canada around. So when you say, with God, there is always hope, what do you mean? Like
God always gives us the opportunity to return to Him. Like Canada was, in a sense, as we talked about before, generally since a Christian country. And as a country, we've turned away from God. But God, we're still alive, and God is still there, and He's willing for us to come back to Him. Like much of the Bible is about repentance. Turn from what's wrong and turn back to God. And God is always willing to receive those who will repent and turn back to Him. So we as Canadians, if our country turns back to God, God will restore us to Him, will bless our country again and restore our freedoms and so on. So that God is always leaving the door open for us to turn back to Him. And when we do turn back to Him, our country will receive these blessings and these freedoms again. So there is always hope. As long as we're alive, we have hope as individuals, and we have hope as a community. If we return back to God, He will bless us again. So thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about in your book or on the topic? Like, this is a while ago since you wrote the book, 2012. Yes.
And I look at your picture. You look so young, Michael.
Thank you.
But now you're white and wise. So is there anything else that you'd like to talk about on this topic, since it's been a while since you wrote the book? Like, I just want to emphasize how significant Pierre Trudeau was for changing the country. Like, he's essentially the founder of modern Canada. It's kind of, when you look at Canadian history, there's Canada before Pierre Trudeau, and Canada after Pierre Trudeau. And probably the biggest significant, the most significant factor, not the only one, but the most significant factor is the Charter, because, Trudeau changed our Constitution and set our country in a different direction. And even though he's dead, every day judges are making decisions based on the Charter that he put into our Constitution. So I think Pierre Trudeau, in a sense, rules Canada from the grave. Wow, that's a strong statement. It is, because judges today are making decisions in accordance with Pierre Trudeau's ideology that he put into our Constitution. Wow, that's very powerful commentary. Michael, it's just been a real privilege to talk to you about this topic, and we look forward to speaking with you more about your other two topics. Well, thank you. It's been fun to talk about this with you. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Michael Wagner. It's been a privilege and an honor to have you here today, and we look forward to speaking with you about reasons why you believe Alberta should leave Canada and why it's time to go. Those two topics are coming up next. As always, I invite you to like and subscribe. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching Alberta Unfiltered. From the